You've probably heard a dozen different stories about why Animal Planet's most brutal fishing show just disappeared. No finale. No big goodbye. One day River Monsters was one of the biggest names in adventure television, and the next, it was gone. Fans filled forums with theories for years. Some said the network pulled the plug. Some said Jeremy Wade got hurt too badly to continue. Some said he simply ran out of monsters to catch. The real answer is stranger, sadder, and honestly more important than any of those theories, and it has almost nothing to do with ratings and everything to do with what was actually happening underneath the water. For 9 seasons, from 2009 to 2017, Jeremy Wade traveled to more than 50 countries for Animal Planet, chasing freshwater giants that most people assumed were myths. He wasn't a typical TV host. Wade trained as a zoologist at the University of Bristol and spent years teaching biology before he ever picked up a camera. That background mattered, because River Monsters was never really pitched as a monster hunting show. In interviews about the show's format, Wade explained the production deliberately approached each story as a kind of investigation, using the mystery of an unexplained attack to pull viewers into the biology and ecology of a river system they'd probably never think about otherwise. A community reports a mysterious attack, sometimes a death, and Wade shows up to investigate, using biology, local knowledge, and old-fashioned fishing skill to figure out which animal was actually responsible. Mekong giant catfish, Goliath tigerfish, freshwater stingrays, arapaima the size of a canoe. Wade tracked them all, and by the time the show wrapped, he had built one of the most recognizable bodies of work in modern nature television. It's also worth pointing out that the show was never purely about entertainment for Wade, even in its most dramatic seasons. Alongside the filming, he worked with actual field scientists on tagging projects, helping researchers get close enough to bull sharks in South Africa and tiger sharks in the Bahamas to attach tracking equipment, and assisting teams trying to collect DNA samples from species considered under particular threat. That side of the work rarely made it into the dramatic cold opens, but it's part of why marine biologists and conservation groups took the show more seriously than a typical cable monster hunt format. Wade wasn't just performing expertise for the camera. He had spent decades building the kind of relationships with researchers and regional communities that let him ask better questions about why a fish population was behaving strangely in the first place, which is exactly the skill set that later made his warnings about river ecosystems worth listening to. So when the show ended without warning, the internet did what the internet always does. It invented a mystery. One popular theory, which even circulated in mainstream entertainment coverage, was almost sweet in its simplicity. Wade had literally caught every legendary fish on his list, and continuing the format would have diluted everything the show stood for. There's some truth buried in that idea. Wade has said the original mission, tracking down the specific legendary creatures the show was built around, had essentially been completed. Repeating the format with lesser-known fish would have meant manufacturing danger and mystery that wasn't really there, and Wade was never willing to do that. He built his reputation on refusing to exaggerate weak evidence into a dramatic conclusion, and that same integrity is part of why the show couldn't just keep going forever. But, he caught them all, is only half the story, and it's the comfortable half. The uncomfortable half is that the fish themselves were disappearing. In the years after River Monsters ended, Wade sat down for an interview tied to World Rivers Day, produced alongside the WWF and connected to Netflix's Our Planet series. In it, he laid out numbers that are honestly more alarming than anything a scripted man-eating fish cold open ever managed. Freshwater megafauna populations, meaning the big, iconic species Wade spent his career chasing, had dropped by roughly 88% globally between 1970 and 2012. The largest freshwater fish, the true giants, had it even worse, with declines close to 94% over that same window. Wade had spent decades personally documenting these animals in the wild, and he was watching the decline happen in real time, river by river, country by country. He's pointed out that most people never register this kind of loss because it happens beneath the surface, invisible unless you're the one wading into the water looking for what used to be there. This wasn't an abstract concern for him either. Wade has fished rivers for more than 50 years, starting as a 7-year-old catching roach near the river he grew up beside. When you've spent half a century watching a river change, you notice things other people miss. In a lecture he gave at Montana State University shortly after the show ended, as part of a trout and salmonid lecture series, Wade talked openly about pollution, dam construction disrupting natural migration routes, and fish populations shrinking across multiple continents. He wasn't blaming any single villain. He was describing a slow, compounding collapse, the kind driven by overfishing, habitat loss, industrial runoff, and rivers being dammed and diverted faster than fish can adapt. People who covered that lecture afterward noted that it landed less like a celebrity guest speaker and more like a genuine warning from someone who had watched the pattern play out across 5 continents. The WWF interview drove the same point home from a different angle. Stuart Orr, who leads WWF's freshwater practice, used the phrase "forgotten fish" to describe the crisis, arguing that freshwater fish feed hundreds of millions of people and support millions more livelihoods, yet their populations keep declining because almost nobody is paying attention. That framing matters for understanding Wade's decision to end river monsters. A show built entirely around the awe and mystery of giant freshwater predators becomes a strange thing to keep producing once you're the person who best understands how quickly those same predators are vanishing. Continuing to sell wonder and spectacle without addressing the collapse underneath, it would have contradicted everything Wade had spent his career building his credibility on. Climate change made the problem harder to film around, too, in a way that sounds almost mundane compared to the show's dramatic marketing, but actually says a lot about how deep the disruption went. Wade has described the annual river cycle becoming unpredictable in ways it never used to be. Flood timing that fishermen and biologists could once set their calendars by started shifting. In an interview with The Big Lead, he explained that during periods of high floodwater, fish spread out so widely across a swollen river system that they become genuinely impossible to locate, which is a very different problem than "the fish are hiding." Speaking with The Guardian, he was blunt about the trend line, noting site index equals 15-1. There has been a marked decline in fish sizes over the last few years. /site for a show that depended on finding record-breaking, headline-worthy giants. A shrinking supply of giants is an existential problem, not a creative one. None of this means the physical demands of filming weren't real, because they absolutely were, and Wade has talked about those too, just without the theatrics that tend to get added by clickbait retellings. River Monsters was filmed almost entirely in remote locations, often places with no nearby hospitals and no quick way to get help if something went wrong. In a Reddit AMA, Wade explained that because so many shoots happened in areas with no emergency services nearby, he and his crew trained specifically to handle injuries themselves, since waiting for outside help simply wasn't an option in the middle of a jungle river system. When Fox News asked him directly what the scariest location he'd worked in was, he pointed to Central Africa, not because of any specific incident, but because of how remote it was from any kind of assistance if something went wrong. Injuries did happen, and Wade has never hidden that. In one interview, he described one of his more dramatic early-season injuries, getting his hand slammed in a vehicle door, which sounds almost funny compared to shark bites and stingray barbs, except that it wasn't. He was bleeding heavily and pushing his cameraman to keep filming through it, and the cameraman refused, insisting Wade needed a hospital instead of a camera pointed at him. That standoff actually shaped how the production handled documentation going forward, with Wade encouraging his crews to keep rolling through incidents whenever it didn't interfere with getting someone help, simply because that's what actually happens on a shoot like this, and pretending otherwise felt dishonest to him. In a separate radio interview, Wade summed up his whole approach to the danger with a phrase that became something of an unofficial motto for the show: "No pain, no game." It wasn't bravado for its own sake. It reflected a genuine philosophy that finding these animals required accepting a level of physical risk most television productions would never sign off on, whether that meant hours spent chest-deep in current, long stretches of heat exhaustion, or the accumulated wear of nearly a decade spent living out of duffel bags in remote field camps. None of that was invented for drama. It was simply what the format actually required, season after season, in order to keep the investigations honest instead of staged. There was also a plane crash, and it's real, but it isn't the secret conspiracy some corners of the internet have turned it into. It happened years before River Monsters existed, during a smaller, lower-budget documentary project called Jungle Hooks, when Wade and his crew were flying over the Amazon and suffered engine failure at low altitude. The single-engine aircraft went down through the tree canopy. Remarkably, everyone walked away without serious injury. Wade has talked about the incident since, including a detail that says a lot about how the brain processes danger. He and the rest of the crew all remembered the time between the engine failing and the plane hitting the trees as feeling like about 3 minutes. When they went back and reviewed the actual footage, the entire sequence lasted 14 seconds. That crash became something of an origin story, not a scandal, and it was actually part of what led to the expedition footage that eventually caught Animal Planet's attention and helped get River Monsters greenlit in the first place. So if the physical risk was real but survivable, and the caught them all explanation is only partly true, What actually tipped the scale toward ending the show in 2017? Based on what Wade has said publicly, it comes down to a combination of factors reinforcing each other rather than one single dramatic cause. The list of globally famous, legendary, freshwater predators, the ones with generations of local folklore built around them, had been worked through. Continuing to manufacture that same sense of discovery around less mysterious species would have meant compromising the documentary-style honesty the show was built on, something Wade was never willing to do just to keep a format alive. At the same time, the ecological backdrop that made the show possible in the first place was eroding. It's a lot harder to build a show around the hunt for a legendary river giant when the rivers themselves are increasingly empty of giants. Add in the genuine physical and logistical toll of running a global production through remote, under-resourced regions for nearly a decade, and you get a show that had, quite literally and quite figuratively, reached the end of the river. What's notable is that Wade didn't walk away from the underlying issue once the cameras stopped rolling on river monsters. In 2018, he returned with Jeremy Wade's Mighty Rivers, a 6-part series that flipped the entire premise. Instead of hunting down individual legendary predators, Wade traveled to major river systems, including the Amazon, the Ganges, the Yangtze, the Mississippi, the Danube, and the Zambezi, to document how exploitation and pollution were pushing these ecosystems toward collapse. The following year brought Jeremy Wade's Dark Waters, which continued investigating unexplained deaths and disappearances tied to freshwater environments around the world, using the same detective-style approach that made River Monsters work, just applied to new mysteries, from a lake in northern Italy rumored to hide a huge, humped creature to the disappearance of king salmon runs in Alaska. Both follow-up shows kept Wade in the field doing exactly the kind of work he'd always done, but with the framing shifted just enough to reflect what he'd actually learned by the end of River Monsters. That the mystery worth investigating wasn't only what attacked this person, but why is this river losing the animals that used to define it? Neither series erased what River Monsters accomplished. If anything, they made its underlying message more explicit. Many of the species that made River Monsters famous are now classified as threatened or endangered, which means the show ended up functioning as an unintentional historical record of animals that may not be around much longer. It also helps to remember just how deliberately Wade and his crews prepared for the risk instead of stumbling into it. Multiple accounts from people who worked with him describe a production that took safety seriously precisely because there was no room for error once you were days from the nearest road. Crew members carried real medical training, not just a first aid kit, because in places like the upper reaches of the Congo or deep stretches of the Amazon, a serious injury couldn't be solved with a phone call. That level of preparation is part of why, across 9 seasons and dozens of genuinely hazardous locations, the show never had a fatality or a catastrophic on-camera incident. The danger was real, but it was managed danger, the product of experience and caution rather than recklessness for ratings. There's a version of this story that's cleaner and more dramatic. Hidden injuries, network cover-ups, a host driven off the air by danger too extreme to broadcast. It's not hard to see why that version spreads. It's got a villain, a secret, and a twist. But the actual story Jeremy Wade has told, across interviews, lectures, and AMAs over several years, is quieter and honestly harder to sit with. He didn't get chased off by a scandal. He ran out of the very thing the show depended on, not footage, not courage, but the fish themselves, at the scale and mystery that built the show's entire identity. The real monster in this story isn't lurking in a river somewhere waiting to be caught. It's the slow, decades-long draining of the rivers themselves, one dam, one polluted tributary, and one overfished season at a time. Wade spent 9 years pulling legends up out of the water to prove they were real. In the end, the more sobering discovery was realizing how fast those legends are disappearing for good. If you want to hear it in his own words, his interviews with the WWF and his Montana State lecture are both publicly available, and they're worth watching in full. Let us know what you think in the comments, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like and subscribe for more.